The morning sun barely broke through the clouds as 16-year-old Daniel stepped off the city bus. He stood there for a moment, staring at the massive iron gates in front of him. Beyond those gates was Riverside Preparatory Academy, and beyond that was a world he'd only seen in movies. Daniel adjusted the straps on his worn backpack and started walking. With each step, the difference between his old life and this new one became clearer. Cars that cost more than most houses rolled past him, dropping off students who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. Their shoes probably cost more than everything Daniel owned. He wasn't supposed to be here. Kids like him didn't go to schools like this. But somehow, against all odds, he'd made it. A scholarship, full ride, all because of piano. The building itself looked like a castle, actual stone columns, fountains in the courtyard, perfectly trimmed hedges that probably had their own gardener. Daniel had spent the last 3 years bouncing between foster homes in the rough part of town, and now he was expected to just fit in here. "Yeah, right. Watch it," someone muttered as they brushed past him, not even looking back. Daniel gripped his music folder tighter. Inside were pieces he'd been practicing for months. Beethoven, Chopin. Music that made him forget where he was sleeping that night, or whether his foster parents would remember to save him dinner. When his fingers touched piano keys, none of that other stuff mattered. His caseworker had been honest with him. "This is a big opportunity, Daniel. But it's not going to be easy. These kids, they come from a different world. They won't understand where you're from." She wasn't wrong. Daniel could already feel the stares as he walked through the hallway. It wasn't anything obvious. Just quick glances. Whispers that stopped when he got too close. The kind of looks that said he didn't belong, even if no one had the guts to say it out loud. The music wing was at the far end of campus. Of course it was. By the time Daniel found it, he was already 10 minutes late to his first class. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and every head turned to look at him. "Mr. Chen, how nice of you to join us," the instructor said. His name was Professor Whitmore, and he had the kind of voice that made everything sound like a criticism. "We start at 8 o'clock sharp here. Perhaps that's different from your previous school?" "Sorry, sir. I got lost." "Well, find a seat. We don't have all day." Daniel spotted an empty chair in the back and quickly sat down. The girl next to him shifted slightly, like she was trying to put more distance between them. He pretended not to notice. Professor Whitmore continued his lecture about the upcoming competition. Apparently it was a huge deal. The annual Riverside Piano Competition. Winners got to perform at some fancy state event and received letters of recommendation that could get them into any music school in the country. This competition has launched the careers of numerous professional musicians, Whitmore said, pacing at the front of the room. Previous winners have gone on to study at Juilliard, Curtis, Berkeley. This is not just a school event. This is your future. Daniel felt something stir in his chest. Hope, maybe. Or desperation. He needed this. Not just wanted it, needed it. This competition could change everything. It could be his ticket out of the system, his chance at a real life. After class, students crowded around Whitmore asking questions about practice schedules and piano assignments. Daniel hung back, waiting for his turn. When the crowd finally cleared, he approached carefully. "Excuse me, Professor Whitmore? I was wondering about practice times." Whitmore looked up from his papers with barely concealed annoyance. "Practice times are posted on the board. Students are assigned specific pianos and time slots. You'll be on piano 7 in the small practice room. Your slot is 6 to 8 a.m. Monday through Friday, 6 in the morning. That meant catching the 5 o'clock bus." Daniel did the math in his head. He'd have to leave his foster home by 4:30. "Is there any chance of a different time slot?" "The schedule has been set for weeks, Mr. Chen. Everyone else managed to review it before classes started. Perhaps you should have been more prepared." There was no point arguing. Daniel just nodded and left. The practice room turned out to be more of a closet. While other students got the grand hall with perfect acoustics and beautiful concert pianos, Daniel's space was tucked away in a corner. The piano looked old. Not vintage old, just old. But it was a piano, and that was all that mattered. He sat down at the bench and let his fingers rest on the keys. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The stares, the comments, the feeling of being completely out of place. It all faded away. Daniel started with scales. Simple warm-ups. Then he moved into the piece he'd been working on, a Chopin nocturne that his old teacher back at Lincoln High had helped him learn, Mrs. Rodriguez. She was the one who'd seen something in him when everyone, else just saw another foster kid who probably wouldn't amount to much. She'd stayed after school 3 days a week to give him free lessons, wrote his scholarship application herself, drove him to the audition because his foster parents at the time couldn't be bothered. When he got accepted, she'd cried. Actually cried. "You've got something special, Daniel," she'd told him. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." He was thinking about her words when someone knocked on the practice room door. Daniel stopped playing and turned around. A tall guy stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 others. Everything about him screamed money. Perfect hair, designer clothes, the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about anything. "So you're the scholarship kid," the guy said. It wasn't a question. "That's me. I'm Preston Ashford. My grandfather is the headmaster here." Of course he was. Daniel stayed quiet, unsure where this was going. "I heard you're planning to enter the competition," Preston continued. "That's cute." One of the guys behind him snickered. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "I've won the last 2 years," Preston said, stepping into the small room. "My family has a tradition here. 5 generations of Ashfords have won that competition. I'm not about to be the one who breaks the streak. May the best player win," Daniel said evenly. Preston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I will. See, the thing is, you might be able to play. Maybe you've got some raw talent or whatever. But this isn't just about playing notes. It's about pedigree, legacy, things you wouldn't understand." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Good luck with that piano, by the way. It's a bit temperamental, but I'm sure you'll manage." The 3 of them left, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Daniel sat there for a long moment, staring at the doorway. Then he turned back to the piano and placed his hands on the keys again. His fingers were shaking slightly, but not from fear. From anger, from determination. He'd been counted out his whole life. Too poor, too damaged, too much of a risk. Every foster home, every school, every time things got hard, people expected him to quit. But Daniel had learned something about himself over the years. The harder they pushed, the harder he pushed back. He started playing again, pouring everything into the music. He didn't know it yet, but in 6 weeks, he'd be facing the biggest challenge of his life. And that old temperamental piano in the corner practice room was about to become the center of something much bigger than a simple school competition. For now, though, he just played. Because that's what he did. That's who he was. And nobody, not Preston Ashford or anyone else, was going to take that away from him. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel started at Riverside Prep, and things weren't getting any easier. If anything, they were getting worse. He'd fallen into a routine. Wake up at 4 in the morning, catch the early bus while it was still dark outside. Practice from 6 to 8. Classes all day, then home to his foster family's small apartment, where he'd practice on the silent keyboard his old teacher had given him. No sound, just the motion of his fingers building muscle memory. His foster mother, Mrs. Chen, tried her best. She'd leave him breakfast in the microwave and always asked about his day. But she worked 2 jobs and was raising 3 other kids. She didn't have time to worry about piano competitions and rich kids playing games. The piano was the problem. Daniel had noticed it during the 2nd week. At first, he thought he was imagining things. Maybe he was tired. Maybe his technique was off. But the more he practiced, the more certain he became. Something was wrong with the instrument. Some of the keys felt heavy, like they were fighting back when he pressed them. The E above middle C was the worst. It took twice as much pressure to get it to sound, and even then, it came out weak and muffled. The F sharp in the upper register stuck sometimes, creating an awkward delay that threw off his timing. And the tuning. God, the tuning was a mess. Several notes in the middle range sounded flat no matter how he adjusted his touch. It made everything he played sound slightly off, like listening to music underwater. Daniel had gone to Professor Whitmore about it during office hours. He'd practiced what he wanted to say, trying to sound respectful but firm. "Professor, I think there might be an issue with my practice piano. Some of the keys aren't responding properly and the tuning seems off." Whitmore had barely looked up from his desk. "Mr. Chen, that piano has been serviced by the same technician for 15 years. I assure you it's in perfect working order. But sir, if you could just come listen." "Are you suggesting I don't know a properly maintained instrument when I hear one?" Whitmore's voice had gone cold. "Perhaps instead of making excuses, you should focus on developing proper technique. Good players adapt to their instruments. They don't blame them. Daniel had left feeling smaller than when he'd walked in. Maybe Whitmore was right. Maybe he just wasn't good enough yet. These other kids had been playing on expensive pianos their whole lives. Maybe his fingers were just used to the cheap keyboards and run-down uprights he'd learned on. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He just couldn't prove it. What Daniel didn't know was that 2 floors above him in one of the luxury practice suites, Preston Ashford was having a very different conversation. "You're sure he won't figure it out?" Preston asked, leaning back in the leather chair that cost more than most people's cars. His friend Tyler grinned. "Relax, my dad's the one who services all the pianos here." He made the adjustment subtle. "The kid will just think he's not good enough." The third member of their group, a guy named Brett, whose family owned half the commercial real estate downtown, laughed. "This is brilliant. He shows up thinking he's hot stuff with his little scholarship, and by competition day, he'll be so psyched out he'll probably drop out." Preston wasn't laughing, though. He'd heard Daniel play once, early in the morning when he'd come in early to practice himself. The kid was good. Really good. Raw. Unpolished. But there was something there. Real emotion. The kind of playing that came from somewhere deep. It had worried Preston more than he wanted to admit. The Ashford family had a reputation to maintain. 5 generations of winners. His grandfather brought it up at every family dinner. The pressure was suffocating. "We need to make sure this works," Preston said quietly. "My grandfather is expecting me to win. He's already told the dean at Berkeley that I'm coming." "It'll work," Tyler assured him. "Trust me. By the time the competition rolls around, he'll be so frustrated he won't know up from down." Preston nodded, but something gnawed at him. This felt wrong. But then again, Daniel was the one who didn't belong here. He was the outsider. This was just leveling the playing field. At least that's what Preston told himself. Back in the cramped practice room, Daniel was discovering just how bad things had gotten. He was working on his competition piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It was ambitious, probably too ambitious, but his old teacher had believed he could handle it. The piece required power and precision, big, thundering chords that needed every key to respond perfectly. But with the way his piano was acting, it was nearly impossible. The heavy keys threw off his rhythm. The flat notes made the harmonies sound muddy, and that sticking F-sharp had almost made him stumble twice during his last run-through. He tried again, starting from the top. His fingers moved through the opening, that haunting descending pattern that had made this piece famous. But when he hit the first big chord, the sound was all wrong. Weak, unbalanced, nothing like what it should be. Daniel slammed his hands on the keys in frustration. The sound echoed in the tiny room. Having trouble? He spun around. A girl stood in the doorway. He recognized her from music theory class. Linda, maybe, or Lauren? He wasn't good with names yet. "The piano's acting weird," he said, then immediately regretted it. He sounded like he was making excuses, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she walked closer, studying the instrument. "Can I try?" Daniel stood up and let her sit. She played a few scales, then some arpeggios, her face scrunched up in concentration. "You're right," she said after a minute. "This E is definitely sluggish. And yeah, the tuning's off in the middle register." Relief flooded through him. "So I'm not crazy?" "No, you're not crazy." She stood up, looking uncomfortable. "Look, I probably shouldn't say anything, but there's been talk." "What kind of talk?" She hesitated, glancing at the door like she was worried someone might hear. "Some of the guys have been joking about it." "About you, Preston and his crew. I didn't think much of it at first, but now..." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What are they saying?" "Just stupid stuff. About how the scholarship kid thinks he can compete with them. How it'll be funny to watch you fail." She paused. "I didn't realize they might actually do something about it." After she left, Daniel sat alone in the practice room for a long time. His mind was racing. Had they done something to his piano? Was that even possible? And if they had, what was he supposed to do about it? He thought about going back to Whitmore, but that had been useless the first time. He thought about reporting it to the dean, but he had no proof. Just a suspicious conversation and a piano that didn't work right. They'd probably say he was paranoid. Or worse, that he was trying to get special treatment. That night, Daniel barely slept. He lay in his small bed in the room he shared with another foster kid, staring at the ceiling. The competition was only 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare a piece that required perfection on an instrument that was sabotaged. He could drop out. save himself the embarrassment. Nobody would blame him. A foster kid from the wrong side of town trying to compete with kids who'd had private instructors since they were 5? It was a long shot anyway. But then he thought about Mrs. Rodriguez, about all those afternoons she'd spent teaching him for free, about the look on her face when he'd gotten the scholarship. She'd believed in him when nobody else did. He thought about every foster home he'd been in, every time someone had looked at him like he was temporary, like he didn't matter, like he wouldn't amount to anything. And he thought about Preston's smug face, the way he'd said good luck with that piano like it was all a big joke. No, he wasn't dropping out. If they'd rigged his piano, then fine. He'd figure out how to play it anyway. He'd practice twice as hard, 3 times as hard. He'd learn every quirk and flaw of that broken instrument until he could make it sing anyway. Daniel rolled over and closed his eyes. His alarm would go off in 3 hours and he'd be back on that early bus, heading to that practice room with its rigged piano and heavy keys. Let them think they'd won. Let them think he'd give up. They had no idea what he'd already survived. A broken piano was nothing compared to the life he'd lived, and if they thought a little sabotage would stop him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The game was on, and Daniel Chen was just getting started. 1 week before the competition, everything changed. Daniel had gotten into the habit of arriving even earlier than his assigned practice time. The building was empty at 5:30 in the morning, and there was something peaceful about being alone with just the music and the silence. No stares, no whispers, just him and the piano, broken as it was. That Tuesday morning he was running late. His foster brother had accidentally unplugged his alarm clock the night before, and Daniel didn't wake up until almost 6. He'd practically sprinted from the bus stop, taking the stairs 2 at a time to get to the music wing. As he rounded the corner toward his practice room, he heard voices. Laughter. The kind of laughter that made his skin crawl because he knew it was at someone's expense, probably his. Daniel slowed down, staying close to the wall. Through the small window in his practice room door, he could see them. Preston, Tyler, and Brett. They were huddled around his piano, and Preston had the fallboard open, exposing the internal mechanisms. "Hand me another one," Preston said. Tyler reached into a small bag and pulled out what looked like a tiny metal weight. Preston attached it to something inside the piano. Even from the hallway, Daniel could see the collection of small weights already clinging to the hammer mechanisms. His breath caught in his throat. So he'd been right. They had sabotaged it. How many more? Brett asked, glancing at his watch. "Just a couple. We want to make sure the big finale chords sound pathetic." Preston stepped back, admiring his work like an artist finishing a painting. The tuning tech Dad hired did good work, but these extra weights are insurance. No way he pulls off that Rachmaninoff now. They started packing up. Daniel barely had time to duck into an empty classroom before they walked past. His heart was hammering so hard he thought they might hear it. He waited until their footsteps faded down the hallway before he moved. For a long moment, he just stood in the doorway of his practice room, staring at the piano. Part of him wanted to march straight to the dean's office, show them what Preston had done, get him expelled or suspended or whatever happened to rich kids who cheated, but another part of him knew how that would go. Preston's grandfather was the headmaster. His family had buildings named after them. Daniel was just the scholarship kid. Who would they believe? He walked slowly to the piano and opened the fallboard the way he'd seen Preston do. Inside was a complex system of hammers and strings and mechanisms he'd never really studied before. And there, attached to several of the hammers, were small lead weights, carefully placed to slow down specific keys. Daniel's hands shook as he started removing them. One by one, he carefully detached each weight, placing them in a small pile on the floor. There were 8 in total. 8 deliberate sabotages meant to ruin his performance. But even with the weights removed, he knew the piano wasn't fixed. The tuning was still off. Some of the keys still felt wrong. Tyler's dad had done his job well. The damage was deeper than just some added weights. Daniel sat down at the bench and put his head in his hands. The competition was in 7 days. 7 days to learn how to perform a technically brutal piece on an instrument designed to make him fail. He could report it. He could try to get a different piano. But something told him that wouldn't work. They'd find another way to sabotage him, and honestly, part of him didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten to him. No. He needed a different plan. That evening, after his last class, Daniel didn't go home. Instead, he went back to the music wing. He knew the building stayed open until 9 for students who wanted extra practice time. And he knew exactly which room he needed to get into. The luxury practice suites were on the 3rd floor. These weren't cramped closets like his room. They were spacious, soundproofed with perfect acoustics and beautiful instruments. Preston's assigned room had a Steinway grand piano worth more than a house. Daniel checked the hallway. Empty. He tried the door. Unlocked. His heart was racing as he slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The room was 3 times the size of his practice space. Awards and photos lined the walls. Pictures of Preston at various competitions, always holding a trophy, always wearing that same confident smile. But Daniel wasn't here for the decorations. He was here for the piano. He sat down at the Steinway and immediately felt the difference. The keys responded perfectly to his touch. Every note rang clear and true. The action was smooth, balanced, precise. This was what a real piano felt like. Daniel started with scales, getting used to the feel of it. Then arpeggios. Then finally he opened his folder and began working through his competition piece. The difference was night and day. On this piano, the Rachmaninoff came alive. The thundering chords had the power they were supposed to have. The delicate passages sang out clear and beautiful. For the first time in weeks, Daniel could hear the piece the way it was meant to sound. He practiced for 2 hours straight, stopping only when his fingers started to cramp. He memorized every detail of how the Steinway responded. The exact pressure needed for each key, the way the sustain pedal felt, the resonance of the soundboard. When he finally left, locking the door carefully behind him, Daniel had a plan forming in his mind. It was risky, maybe even a little crazy, but it was the only shot he had. Over the next week, Daniel lived a double life. During his assigned practice time, he worked on his broken piano. He learned every flaw, every quirk, every problem. He practiced compensating for the heavy keys by pressing harder. He adjusted his playing to account for the flat notes. He learned to avoid the sticky F-sharp, or hit it at just the right angle to make it work. But every evening when the building was quiet, he snuck into Preston's practice room and played the Steinway. He needed to be ready to perform on any piano, broken or perfect, because he had no idea what they'd give him on competition day. Mrs. Chen noticed the change in him. He'd come home exhausted, fingers aching, but there was a determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You okay?" she asked one night, finding him practicing on his silent keyboard at midnight. "Yeah," Daniel said, and he meant it. "I'm okay. You know you don't have to prove anything to those kids, right? You're already better than all of them just by showing up every day." Daniel smiled. "I'm not doing this to prove anything to them. I'm doing it for me." She squeezed his shoulder and left him to practice. The night before the competition, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed going over the piece in his mind, his fingers twitching slightly as he played each note in his imagination. He thought about Preston and his friends, probably sleeping soundly in their expensive beds, confident that tomorrow would be just another easy win. They had no idea what was coming. Daniel had spent 3 years bouncing between foster homes, never knowing where he'd be sleeping from one month to the next. He'd learned to adapt, to survive, to make the best of whatever situation he was thrown into. A rigged piano. That was just another challenge, another obstacle to overcome. He'd been underestimated his whole life. Teachers who thought he wouldn't graduate. Social workers who assumed he'd end up in trouble. Foster parents who treated him like a temporary inconvenience. Everyone always betting against him. Tomorrow he'd show them all what happens when you bet against someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Daniel closed his eyes and finally drifted off to sleep. His alarm was set for 4 in the morning. The competition started at noon, and somewhere in that building a rigged piano was waiting for him. Let it wait. He was ready. Whatever they threw at him tomorrow, whatever obstacles they put in his way, he'd face them head on. Because that's what survivors do. They adapt. They overcome. They win. And Daniel Chen was a survivor. The auditorium was packed. Daniel had never seen so many people dressed so formally for a school event. Parents in designer suits and expensive dresses filled the front rows. Local music critics sat with notepads. Even some reporters from the city paper were there, cameras ready. This wasn't just a competition. It was a social event, a place to see and be seen. Daniel stood backstage, peeking through the curtain. His stomach was doing flips. He'd performed before, but never like this. Never with so much riding on it. Never knowing that people were actively rooting for him to fail. Nervous? He turned to see Lauren, the girl who'd confirmed his suspicions about the piano weeks ago. She was performing too, scheduled to go on before him. Terrified, Daniel admitted. "You'll do great. I've heard you practice. You're really good." She paused. "Better than Preston, honestly. Though don't tell him I said that." She walked away to warm up, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He could hear the audience settling in, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. Somewhere out there, Mrs. Chen was sitting in the back row. She'd taken the afternoon off work to be here. That meant something. Professor Whitmore walked to center stage and the crowd quieted down. He gave a long speech about the prestigious history of the competition, about excellence and tradition, about how Riverside Preparatory produced the finest musicians in the state. Daniel tuned most of it out. Then Whitmore started announcing the performance order. Lauren would go third. Preston was scheduled fifth. And Daniel, he was dead last. The final performer of the day. "And now," Whitmore said with theatrical flair, "let me address the instrument assignments. In the interest of fairness and consistency, each student will perform on their assigned practice piano. The instrument they've been working with all semester." Daniel's heart sank. So that was it. They were making sure he'd be stuck with the sabotaged piano. No chance of switching. No possibility of a fair shot. He looked across the backstage area and caught Preston's eye. Preston was smirking, not even trying to hide it. He knew exactly what that announcement meant. The competition began. The first student played a Mozart sonata. Clean, technical, but forgettable. The second did Debussy. Beautiful, but she made a few mistakes that had the judges scribbling notes. Then Lauren went up. She'd chosen a Chopin nocturne, and she played it beautifully. Emotional, controlled, nearly perfect. When she finished, the applause was genuine and warm. Daniel made a mental note to congratulate her later. 2 more students performed. Both good. Both safe choices that showcased their technical skills without taking any real risks. Then it was Preston's turn. He walked onto the stage like he owned it. And in a way he did. His family's name was literally engraved on a plaque in the lobby. He sat at his perfect Steinway, adjusted the bench slightly, and began. Preston had chosen Liszt, Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a crowd pleaser. The kind of piece that sounds incredibly impressive even if it's not perfectly executed. And Preston did execute it well. His technique was solid. His timing was good. The notes were all there, but something was missing. Daniel couldn't quite put his finger on it. The playing was technically correct, but it felt hollow. Like Preston was going through the motions, hitting all the right notes but not really feeling any of them. It was the musical equivalent of a beautiful painting with no soul behind it. Still, the audience loved it. They applauded loudly. Preston's grandfather stood up, beaming with pride. Several of the judges nodded approvingly. Preston walked off stage, and as he passed Daniel, he leaned in close. "Good luck following that, scholarship boy. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." 3 more students performed. Daniel barely heard them. His mind was racing, going over every note of his piece, every tricky passage, every place where the broken piano might betray him. Finally, Whitmore called his name. "Our final performer of the afternoon, Daniel Chen, will be playing Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor." There was a slight murmur in the crowd. It was an ambitious choice, maybe too ambitious for a 16-year-old, especially one from his background. Daniel walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding. He couldn't see the audience clearly, just dark shapes and the occasional glint of jewelry or glasses. His hands were sweating. He wiped them on his pants as casually as he could manage. Then he saw the piano. His piano. The one with the heavy keys and flat notes and all its problems. They'd wheeled it onto the stage and positioned it under the lights like it was some kind of prize. He sat down at the bench and took a breath. His fingers found the keys. Even now he could feel how wrong they were. The E that required too much pressure, the F sharp that liked to stick. The notes in the middle register that would sound flat no matter what he did. For a moment, doubt crashed over him like a wave. What was he thinking? He couldn't pull this off. Not on this piano. Not in front of all these people. He was going to humiliate himself. Then he remembered something Mrs. Rodriguez had told him once back when he was just starting out. Music isn't about the instrument, Daniel. It's about what you bring to it. A real musician can make anything sing. Daniel closed his eyes. He thought about every foster home. Every time he'd been told he wasn't good enough. Every obstacle that had tried to break him. Every person who'd bet against him. He thought about Preston and his friends sitting out there right now waiting for him to fail. Probably already celebrating their victory in their minds. And he thought about Mrs. Chen sitting in the back row, believing in him even when he didn't believe in himself. Daniel opened his eyes and positioned his hands over the keys. Then he began to play. The opening notes of the Rachmaninoff rang out. Those haunting, descending chords that had scared people in concert halls for over a century. Daniel pressed harder on the heavy keys, compensating automatically for their resistance. He'd practiced this so many times he didn't even have to think about it anymore. The piece built in intensity. His left hand thundered out the bass line while his right hand wove the melody above it. When he hit the problematic E, he adjusted his pressure instinctively. When the F-sharp tried to stick, he was ready for it, striking it at just the right angle to make it work. But something was happening that he hadn't expected. All those hours of fighting with the broken piano, all that struggle to make it cooperate had taught him something. He'd learned to put more of himself into every note. More force, more emotion, more intensity. The Rachmaninoff wasn't just technically difficult, it was emotionally brutal. It demanded everything from the performer. And Daniel had everything to give. Every frustration, every anger, every ounce of determination he'd built up over the past weeks came pouring out through his fingers. He wasn't just playing the piece. He was living it. Every note carried the weight of his story. The loneliness of foster care, the struggle of never fitting in, the burning desire to prove that he was worth something, that he mattered. The broken piano became part of that story. The heavy keys and flat notes weren't obstacles anymore. They were textures. They were colors. They were proof that something beautiful could come from something damaged. The audience had gone completely silent. Even the judges had stopped taking notes and were just listening. Daniel reached the climax of the piece, those massive cascading chords that Rachmaninoff had written to shake the walls of concert halls. His hands flew across the keys, and despite everything wrong with the piano, the music soared. It filled every corner of the auditorium. It made the air vibrate. Then came the ending. Those final quiet chords that fade away into silence like a whisper. Daniel played them with such delicacy, such control, that you could hear people in the audience holding their breath. The last note hung in the air. Daniel kept his hands on the keys for a moment, letting it ring out completely before lifting his fingers. Silence. Complete and total silence. For one horrible second, Daniel thought he'd failed. That it had been so bad nobody knew how to react. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, then another. Then suddenly the entire auditorium erupted in applause. People were standing up. Actually standing up. Daniel stood dazed and turned to face the audience. The lights made it hard to see clearly, but he could make out Mrs. Chen in the back, her hands clasped together, tears streaming down her face. Several of the judges were wiping their eyes. One of them, an older woman with gray hair, was shaking her head in disbelief. As Daniel walked off stage, his legs shaking, he passed Preston. The smirk was gone. Preston's face had gone pale. His mouth was hanging slightly open. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to, he'd done it. Against all odds, with a sabotaged piano and the entire world expecting him to fail, he'd done it. Now he just had to wait for the results. The judges deliberated for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Daniel sat backstage, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. Other students congratulated him, some genuinely, others with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Lauren came over and hugged him. That was incredible. I've never heard anything like that. Thanks, Daniel managed. His voice felt strange, like it belonged to someone else. Preston was nowhere to be seen. He disappeared right after Daniel's performance, probably to one of those luxury rooms on the 3rd floor. Finally, Professor Whitmore returned to the stage. The audience settled back into their seats. Daniel's heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. Ladies and gentlemen, the judges have reached their decision. But before we announce the results, the head judge, Dr. Patricia Montgomery, would like to say a few words. An older woman with kind eyes stepped up to the microphone. Daniel recognized her from the program. She'd been a concert pianist herself before becoming a teacher and judge. Her opinion carried serious weight in the classical music world. Thank you, Professor Whitmore. I've been judging student competitions for over 30 years, and I must say, today has been extraordinary. She paused, looking down at her notes. We witnessed excellent technical proficiency from many students. Clean execution, proper form, everything we expect to see at this level. Daniel's stomach churned. This sounded like she was building up to announce Preston as the winner. However, Dr. Montgomery continued, technical skill alone does not make art. Music, at its highest level, is about communication. It's about taking the notes on a page and breathing life into them. It's about making an audience feel something real. She looked directly toward the backstage area, though Daniel wasn't sure if she could actually see him. Today, we witnessed a performance that transcended technical execution. We heard a young musician who didn't just play Rachmaninoff. He embodied it. He made us understand why that piece has moved audiences for over a century. The auditorium was completely silent. What made this performance even more remarkable, Dr. Montgomery said, her voice taking on an edge, is that it was accomplished on an instrument that was clearly not in proper condition. Daniel's breath caught. Professor Whitmore shifted uncomfortably on stage. The piano used in the final performance had multiple mechanical issues: sluggish keys, poor tuning, inconsistent response. Any professional could hear it. And yet the performer adapted. He compensated. He found ways to make music despite these obstacles. She paused, letting that sink in. Which raises some questions that I believe this institution needs to address. But that's a conversation for later. For now, let me announce that the judges were unanimous in their decision. First place goes to Daniel Chen. The applause was deafening. People were on their feet again. Daniel stood up, feeling like he was floating. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to kids like him, but it was real. He walked onto the stage, and Dr. Montgomery handed him a trophy that was surprisingly heavy. She leaned in close as they shook hands. I don't know what happened with that piano, she whispered, but I intend to find out. What you did today was remarkable. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Photos were taken. Hands were shaken. People he'd never met congratulated him and handed him business cards. Representatives from 3 different music conservatories introduced themselves and asked him to consider applying. Mrs. Chen made her way through the crowd and hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. I'm so proud of you, she kept saying. So proud. When the crowd finally thinned out, Daniel noticed Tyler standing near the back of the auditorium. He looked nervous, guilty. Can I talk to you? Tyler asked quietly. Daniel wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to get lost. But something in Tyler's expression made him nod. They walked outside to the courtyard. Tyler wouldn't meet his eyes. Look, I need to tell you something, and then you can do whatever you want with the information. He took a breath. My dad services all the pianos here. Preston asked him to mess with yours. Detune it, make some of the keys heavy. My dad didn't want to do it. But Preston's family, they're important clients. They could have ruined his business. I know, Daniel said. I saw you guys adding weights to the hammers. Tyler's eyes widened. You knew? But you didn't say anything? Who would have believed me? Tyler was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. It was wrong. I told my dad we needed to come clean, and he agreed. We're going to tell the dean everything. Preston's probably going to get suspended. Maybe expelled. Why tell me this now? Daniel asked. Because you deserved better. And because what you did today, making that broken piano sound like that. It was amazing. You earned this win fair and square. Actually, you earned it against unfair odds, which makes it even more impressive. Tyler left, and Daniel sat alone on a bench in the courtyard. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. His trophy sat next to him, catching the light. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. The struggle, the doubt, the anger, all of it had been worth it. The next few days were chaotic. Tyler and his father did go to the dean with the full story. An investigation was launched. Preston was suspended for the rest of the semester. and banned from competing in any school events for 2 years. Brett and the others got similar punishments. Professor Whitmore was placed on administrative leave for ignoring Daniel's complaints about the piano. Turns out several other students had tried to report issues with their instruments over the years, and he dismissed all of them too. The local paper ran a story about the competition with the headline, "Foster Teen Triumphs Despite Sabotage at Elite Prep School." It picked up traction online. People loved the underdog story. Daniel's performance video was shared thousands of times, but the best part came 2 weeks later. Daniel received an envelope in the mail from Berklee College of Music. Inside was a letter offering him a full scholarship. They'd heard about what happened and wanted him to know that talent and determination like his deserved to be nurtured. Similar letters came from 2 other conservatories, all full rides, all impressed by not just his playing but his character. Mrs. Chen framed the Berklee letter and hung it in the living room next to his competition photo. "So people remember," she said, "that good things can happen to good people who work hard." Daniel went back to his practice routine, but now he had access to the good practice rooms with the proper pianos. The school had insisted on it after the scandal. It felt strange at first, having keys that responded perfectly, notes that rang true. Sometimes he almost missed that broken piano. It had taught him something valuable, that obstacles weren't excuses, that limitations could be overcome, that real talent wasn't about having perfect tools, it was about making the most of whatever you had. One afternoon, months later, Daniel ran into Preston in the hallway. It was awkward. Preston looked tired, humbled in a way he hadn't been before. "Hey," Preston said quietly. "Can we talk?" They found an empty classroom. Preston sat down heavily, looking at his hands. "I owe you an apology. A real one. What I did was horrible. I was scared that you were better than me. So instead of working harder, I tried to sabotage you." "That's pathetic." Daniel didn't say anything, just waited. "My whole life, everything's been handed to me. The best teachers, the best instruments, the best everything. And I thought that meant I deserved to win. But you showed me that none of that matters if you don't have the heart for it." Preston looked up. "You have something I've never had. Real passion, real hunger. That's why you won. Not despite the sabotage, but maybe even because of it. It brought out something in you." "Thanks," Daniel said simply. "Are you going to Berklee?" "Yeah, full scholarship," Preston nodded. "You'll do great there. You'll do great anywhere. I mean that." They shook hands, and for the first time it felt genuine. Years later, Daniel would look back on that competition as the turning point in his life. Not just because he won, but because of what he learned, that he was stronger than he thought, that obstacles were opportunities in disguise, that the people who counted him out had underestimated what someone with nothing to lose could accomplish. He went on to graduate from Berklee with honors. Performed in concert halls across the country, became a teacher himself, specializing in working with underprivileged kids who had talent but lacked opportunity. And in every masterclass he taught, he'd tell his students the same thing. Your circumstances don't define your potential. Your response to those circumstances does. Someone might rig the piano, but they can't rig your heart. They can't rig your determination. And they definitely can't rig your soul. The trophy from that competition sat on his desk for the rest of his life. Not because it was gold or impressive, but because it reminded him of a simple truth he'd learned at 16 years old. When life gives you a broken piano, you don't make excuses. You don't give up. You learn to make it sing anyway. And sometimes that broken piano creates the most beautiful music of all.